Good morning, family. Welcome to the latest episode of African Square TV with the WCC We Church Colonialism. Today's going to be a very interesting topic. Probably, I said last week that topic was very important. This probably is possibly more important. And I think more pertinent to the purpose of the book that I wrote, the book Fostering False Identity, the Child Welfare System Design of Social Control of the Black Family. So this really goes to the heart of what the book is about, the fact that foster care and child welfare is used for the assimilation of African children into the white mainstream. And it's used as a political weapon, something it's not often identified as. But we as African people, we have to be aware of the tricks that are being done against us. We have to be aware of how white supremacy functions and aware of how our children are the ones that are being subjected to horrible treatment, horrible traumas from this system. And so this topic right here, I think, goes to the heart of the controversy: transracial adoptions and the Black assimilationist agenda in the United States of America. The assimilationist agenda has fluctuated throughout the times. We're going to talk about that today. And we're also going to talk about why transracial adoptions should not be something that is accepted by the African community, why it should be something that's rejected, and why we have to understand that even inside of the most beautiful circumstance that is advertised, this beautiful circumstance where they say this child was abused, this child was abandoned, this child was drug addicted at birth, these horrible circumstances that are painted for us, and then this white family comes in and saves the child. Or even to internationalize the issue, if we're talking about the child who is poor in Africa, the child who has no connection to their family or connection to their, the child is poor in Africa, the child who has no providence is what I meant to say, and their family abandoned them. That child gets saved by some white European person. They come in and they swoop in and they save this child. And this is a beautiful scenario that's painted throughout the media. We have to analyze these things, analyze why these things are political tricks, understand that these are not solutions. These are, if in themselves, they create new problems, not just for the child, but actually for the African continent and also the African people throughout the United States also. So we're going to talk about that today. So I do want to just announce very quickly, though, next week, Friday the 17th, that is going to be the 70th anniversary of We Charge Genocide. I'm sure many of you know We Charge Colonialism. We got our name from We Charge Genocide when you had a number of Africans go to the United Nations and charge the United States with genocide. That's the 70th anniversary. And that is the day where we are releasing the Africa Unity Movement for Decolonization. That is a coalition of a number of many prominent Pan-Africanist organizations, many that you probably are aware of. We're going to be releasing a declaration of colonialism. We're going to charge the colonial powers with colonialism. That will be released next week. So I'm just giving everyone a heads up. You'll probably see some interviews. We have one interview scheduled for the 13th on the African Diaspora News Channel. I believe that's for 2 p.m. And we have another one that will be on my channel, on this channel next week. And we'll be trying to push this message because we should understand what the oppressor is doing, who the oppressor is. So please keep watch for that. When the report drops, please read it. Please analyze it. Please give us your thoughts, and let's just push this movement forward because we have to identify our oppressors. So let's get to it. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm gonna drink my tea. Y'all know I need my tea before I start. So let's start off with talking about the issue of transracial adoptions. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to sorry, I'm having some problems sharing my screen right now. I think I can. Okay. Everyone, if you can see my screen, yep, I can see it myself. So I know you all can see it too. So let's go to just some of the images that were often shown of transracial adoption as I said, this gets painted as being something that is for the best interest of children. We're often shown pictures of celebrities going and adopting children. You see Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. They have, I believe, their son was Korean, if I'm correct, and also their daughter, I believe, Ethiopian. You could feel free to correct me inside of the chat. These are images that are shown to us throughout the media very frequently. This is Charlize Theron. Her adopted child. And the images that get conveyed is that these people are saving children. Now, if you see, I'm sure all of you have seen The Blind Side by now. This was kind of like the opening to what would come next, with Sandra Bullock adopting this African child. So these are the images that are put in the media. And we should ask the one question that's obvious. Why is it that the media is so fascinated with people whenever they adopt children transracially? And the question, I think we can kind of figure out pretty easily. One, it kind of goes to what we've been talking about this whole time with the book Fostering False Identity, which I did not post the link to, even though I'm supposed to, although I think it's in the description if you want to see it. But what I talk about in the book, prior to getting to African children, is the fact that there's a setup in America where children are seen as being an easy target when it comes to neutralizing the political potential of a people. If you take their children while they're young, if you take their children and you indoctrinate them with white society, you indoctrinate them with our customs, with our behaviors, and you basically take that child, whether it's a European child that came from Ireland and came from Italy. And as I said in previous videos, at one time, unless you were Anglo-Saxon in the United States, you were not considered white. Although now we consider all people who are European to be white, meaning the assimilation campaign basically worked for the United States whenever they took a lot of immigrant children and placed them in Anglo-Saxon homes. So that was seen as a way to neutralize them. It was seen as a way to neutralize Native Americans whenever they took their children, many times took them to these boarding schools where horrible acts of cultural genocide were done. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to practice their customs. And essentially they had to become white. They neutralized many inside of the indigenous American movement that way. So this is something that they perfected. By the time they got to us, this weapon has been perfected by the white supremacist system. And what we have to understand is that the agenda has not changed. That's the big reason that I wanted to start off the book breaking down what the agenda was before, to assimilate these European children, to assimilate these Native American children, because we have to understand that the agenda is literally the same today. Whenever you see people advertising transracial adoptions as if this is the solution to all of the horrible problems happening throughout the world with Africans, all of the horrible ways that they are oppressed. And this is the solution. We're going to save them. We're going to put them inside of these rich homes with these white folks or middle-class homes, and we're going to give them a better life. This is not the solution. The solution is to stop colonizing Africans, to stop oppressing Africans, to stop using violence against us in our communities. But the easy solution for the media to spin is take the children and place them inside of better homes. So we're going to see that this is something that has a long historical legacy. Now, before we get deep into the issue of transracial adoptions, you have to first understand the assimilation issue. And we have to talk about how assimilation was different inside of the African community than it was inside of the Native American community, and also inside of the European immigrant community. I'm going to just go through some key differences. One, we should understand when Africans were stolen from Africa and brought to the United States to work as free laborers for the system, it was never intended that we become a part of this society. I talked about this last week, but I want to emphasize it again. It was never intended for us to be a part of this society, these United States of America. We were supposed to be a permanent class of laborers, a permanent class for the system to deplete. And if it came to the case where we were no longer needed, they would find other ways to get rid of us, albeit whether that be send us back to Africa, whether that be to completely just exterminate, they would find whatever means necessary to get rid of us. We were never supposed to be a part of this society. So because of that, assimilation was not originally the intent whenever we were brought over. And it really was not the intent until the later 19th century, later 20th century. That's when you started seeing assimilation become a potential tool to actually neutralize the politicized African side of America. But even whenever it was, this is the second difference I would say, it was never meant that all of us be assimilated into this system. To this day, we are still a vital commodity to the American capitalist system, whether that be through the prison industrial complex, whether that be through social services. They basically use us as a commodity still to this day. So it could be free labor, it could be cheap labor, whether they need you to work their jobs. It could be the fact that they want to use you in order to fund their other industries. Social welfare is a huge industry. It's a huge industry where there's a lot of stakes, a lot of people who get money from the fact that we are suffering. So that's the other thing we should understand. It was never meant to be a total assimilation program yet. Now, I'm sure that the system of white supremacy could easily evolve on that and say, okay, let's just try to get rid of all political threats and just make all of them like lose their identities and become a part of the dominant white society. But as of right now, it has not become the tool across the board. Only inside of certain circumstances, whenever it has been deemed most appropriate. And we're going to talk about one of the instances is with children. And the other thing that we're going to get into, and it's probably the most devastating part of the Black assimilation campaign in the United States that we should understand. Whereas I would say that you did not hear a big push coming from the immigrant community who was in the United States, the European immigrant community, to be assimilated into the white culture in such a way they would lose their identity. And it was not a push with indigenous Americans in such a way that they would lose their identity. Unfortunately, one of the first ones to start pushing this agenda inside of the United States on a mass scale was Black leaders. And that's a crucial difference, because we're going to have to understand why certain psyches inside of our community have really manifested into being something that's self-defeating. I'm going to share this tweet that was posted. Let's see, share my screen again. Entire screen, it's loading. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna share this tweet that was posted, and it really goes to the heart of this issue, I feel. So some of you might have seen this. This is posted on Twitter. Someone said, Pan-African YouTuber, African Esquire, criticized Native Black Americans for refusing to define themselves as Africans. But she doesn't know that real Africans don't see us as Africans. Now, this was a previous video that he cut up. Changed my voice, by the way, but he cut up this previous video that I made on African identity and used this as a way to basically criticize me. Of course, this never being done inside of a matter that is uplifting, right? And the thing that I also want to emphasize about this ADOS and FBA movement, that I know two types of subjects. If I cover two subjects, I'm going to be bombarded inside of a way that I'm not bombarded on my YouTube channel. So for example, if I cover Ghana and I cover and criticize Nana Akufo-Addo, I am already expecting many of my Ghanaian brothers and sisters to hop on. Not all of them, because we should understand that it's very fractured politics over there, like many other nations. But a lot of people, particularly in the NPP party, ride for Nana Akufo-Addo. So I expect if I do a video criticizing him, I'm going to get flocked with a lot of people who say, how dare you? But I expect more so if I say anything about being an African, about accepting African identity, or have any criticism against people who identify as ADOS or FBA, I expect that I'm going to get a certain level of vitriol. And I've said before, what I did not originally expect when I first criticized the ADOS movement a couple of years ago, I was not anticipating people who look like me, people who are my people. I mean, if you're talking about people who are Africans that are descended from the people who were victimized through the transatlantic slave trade, specifically in America, I'm, someone who comes from that legacy. And those people who look like me, who to me, I would say are my people, tearing me down. I mean, I was called all types of things, and it threw me off guard, because I'm like, dang, like this is some white supremacist type talk. So we have to understand, what is it that's driving this? To where you have so many people, and by the way, I'm not saying every single person that identifies as these different categories has the same vitriol. It changes across the board, but I'll say I've never experienced it like that until I actually criticized people who identify with those movements. So we have to understand there's something else behind this. There's something deep behind this. Something disturbs a lot of people when you call them an African. A lot of people. I've heard this throughout my life. I've heard all types of reasons. I've heard people say, I'm not an African. There's white people in South Africa. Those are Africans. Don't call me an African. I'm Black. I'm a Black American. Or some people don't even want to be a Black American. They'll say, I'm an American. There's this real deep sense of insecurity, and a lot of it we have to understand it's psychological. A lot of it is historical. It's been passed down through time, and a lot of us, we just say things and react to these titles based on no historical reference for why we ended up inside of this way to begin with. You know, where did we start hating Africa? That should be the first question. When did it happen? What was the reason? Were we basing our hatred of the place where our ancestors come from? And by the way, even if you don't feel connected to Africa, that is still the place where your ancestors come from. And if you look at those slave ships and you see those people who were put inside of there like they were sausages inside of a can, and with no regard for their humanity, and you have no love for those people because at that time they were too African for you, that's a real problem. So personally, I don't really get how you could disregard being African or even Africa, period, even if you don't feel African. And we could talk about why you might not feel African, but if you have gone through your life saying that's not me, the hatred and the vitriol, that has to come from somewhere. You know, you never hear anyone else regard their people like that. I've never once heard. And by the way, many people come with this whole, we're not African, there's different parts of Africa, blah, 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 blah. You know, Africa is a continent, it's not one country. I have never once heard in my entire life when I talk to people who are of European descent. First of all, many of them have many different European cultures. I've never once heard them say, oh, I'm not Italian, I'm American. Or, oh, I'm not German, I'm American. No, they know where they come from and they rep that. And you don't just see that as far as culture. You also see that in a political sense. Why is it that why does NATO exist? Why does there have to be a special military alliance just for people who come from Europe? That is because they have a political unity. So there's a cultural unity. You understand every single time that a European country is attacked, why does the news in the United States or in Western media cover that like it's like them? Why is it whenever there was attacks in London or attacks in France, despite the fact that most people in America would never say I'm French or never say I'm English, why is it that those people look at that as themselves? They don't have the same confusion about who they are as Africans or people of African descent. You don't hear the same type of confusion coming from people who are of Asian descent. They're not confused about who they are. You don't hear them saying, oh, I'm not Korean, I'm American. And understand, there's many Asians who have been in this country for a long, long time. They don't have any confusion about that. They don't feel any shame. They don't feel any backlash. They don't have a knee-jerk reaction that we have. Whenever you talk to indigenous Americans, you don't see the same thing. So we have to understand, as the people inside of this world who are suffering the most on a global scale, and this is not just about us in America. This is also about some people who don't feel like Nigerians and Ghanaians and people from Sierra Leone, that we are all one. Some people have reactions also severely to that idea. We have to understand something was done to us to make us disassociate ourselves from our mother continent or from each other. So if you hate what was done to you, and I hope you do. I hope you don't just look at what was done to you as the past. I hope that you hate what they did to your ancestors. I hope that you hate when they embedded them with self-hatred, with hatred for Africa. I hope you hate that more than you hate anything else about your experiences. You know, I hope that you hate that with a certain type of regard, that you want to go back and figure out what they did and what they taught you so that you can undo it. Because if you don't hate enslavement, if you don't hate what was done to you during enslavement, then you're going to be welcoming of the continual enslavement that's going to happen to you, whether you know it or not. So that's what we're going to go into today. All right, y'all. So let's jump into this. I took way much longer than I expected to introduce this topic, but you know, it kind of stirs up some feelings because I think some of us, we just want to pass through life without asking the critical questions about what happened to us. And it's unfortunate because over and over again, we're losing a key fact that what happened to us was done to basically cause what's happening today. That is powerlessness, that is confusion, that is disunity. All those things that were done to make us disassociate from who we are has a direct causal relationship to what we see in African communities today. So I do want to talk a little bit about the assimilationist issue, more about the historical foundation before we get deep into the transracial talk. And transracial talk is a lot too. And by the way, this chapter, I cut a lot out that I wrote about in this chapter because I think it's probably the biggest chapter in the book. So if you have the book, if you don't, I put it in the description. I would definitely read through the whole chapter. Don't think that this summary of some key issues is going to cover everything. There's a lot more that needs to be discussed. Okay, so when it comes to assimilationists, what have we learned so far? I started out when I talked about the European immigrants who were assimilated into America and also the indigenous Americans, that there was an idea called climate theory. Climate theory says these people are barbaric. These people are other. They are not of us. But if you take them from their savage surroundings and put them inside of the proper place, then they will become like us. That is climate theory. Believe it or not, it's seen as more sympathetic to the oppressed people, as more philanthropic. It's seen as like better than actually the other ways that they address us. Just saying we're inferior and we're just going to ever be inferior. No, they're saying you're inferior, but you can become like us if you come where we are. Now, climate theory, first, it actually began as literally climate. Like the idea was that Africans, who are darker skinned, if you take those Africans and you put them inside of Europe, those people's skin color would change. It would become lighter. That was the original climate theory. It morphed into a cultural climate theory. So basically saying those people who are African, they're inside of these savage jungles. These jungles, they, hunt each other, they kill each other, they're cannibals, they do all these crazy types of things, right? Let's take them from their savage surroundings and put them in Europe. And in Europe, they will become European because color is inconsequential. What really matters is that you are inside of the proper settings. That, again, was seen as a more admirable approach to dealing with other types of groups. So it's important to emphasize it was the idea that you are inferior, but I'm going to help you become like us. Now, the issue that comes to today when it comes to climate theory, because it has existed in European society globally, and it obviously has existed in America. But whenever it came to America, it was used as a rationale to justify conditions that had nothing to do with who you are. So, for example, I said last week, one of the reasons that it's important to understand what happened to Africans in the United States, how our communities were destroyed, is because if you do not understand what happened step by step, how this white supremacist system literally destroyed our people, you will be left to think that Africans naturally created these conditions. So I said, for me, I didn't know about things like redlining. I knew about slavery, but I didn't know about redlining. I didn't know so much about Jim Crow. I didn't know about the prison industrial complex. Like, I didn't know all these things as a child. So as a child, as I'm going throughout the world and I'm looking around and I'm experiencing the world, the thing that I notice and I take in is that, wow, we doing bad. Now, if I don't have a historical reference, the natural inclination is that we're just naturally bad. Or the other one that you might have is, okay, well, we were good, but slavery just made us bad. I covered in a previous video that slavery did not wipe away who we were. We still were Africans. We still practiced our culture and we still had our traditions. So slavery did not turn us into what we're experiencing today. What turned us into what we're experiencing today is a historical, decades-long, centuries-long struggle to wipe away who we are and destabilize our communities. So we have to understand that. But with climate theory, you don't have to have that analysis because essentially, you can say the poverty, the crime, the poor health conditions, it has nothing to do with what we have done. It has to do with who you are and your surroundings. So what we have to do to be good to you is take you out of your conditions and put you somewhere where you will be more suitable for this society. That's the rationale. And I hope you can see how that's dangerous whenever you're dealing with people who are basically oppressing you, making policies that affect you. Putting policies, laws laws on the books that are going to affect not just you, but your children. So I'm going to read through, and then I'm going to go in and look for some questions. And again, please, if you have a question, if you put a question mark, if you put multiple question marks, I'll definitely see your question. I'm going to read through just some Black leaders, African people who we have respect for, obviously, but we also have to understand some of them were flawed inside of their understandings whenever it came to liberation. We're going to talk about Frederick Douglass. I'm going to quote from him, and I'm not saying that he felt this way when he died. I'm personally not aware of that, but this is something that he said, and this is something that we should understand is present with a lot of people, even if they don't say it. So he said when he was in Cleveland once, he said, "Need we go behind the vicissitudes," I never seen this word, "of barbarism for an explanation of the gaunt, weary, ape-like appearance of some of the genuine Negroes? Need we look higher than a vertical sun or lower than the damp black soil of West Africa for an explanation of the Negro's color?" He said that at the very heart of the civilized world, that is what we're not. So he's talking about Africa. He's talking about this idea that Africa was barbaric and that we are at the heart of civilized world because we're in America, right? I'm going to go into a quote by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, I'm positive that W.E.B. Du Bois did not feel or think this way when he died, because as we saw, W.E.B. Du Bois is someone who started off with assimilationist politics, but became radical. And then over time, by the time he died, he was living in Ghana and basically kicked out by the United States government because he was too radical. But the earlier assimilationist W.E.B. Du Bois said this. He said, "To be sure, the darker races are today the least advanced in culture according to European standards," he said. He said that the capacity to one day reach those high ideals would come as practically soon. So even him, someone who came up throughout the civil rights movement, in the beginning, he held very assimilationist attitudes. Of course, we should know that these things were taught to us. We were taught to think that we were not doing well in Africa. Now, of course, we're taught that people who live off the earth, people who practice communalism, people who gather together and figure out our problems collectively instead of being an individualistic, those people are backwards. The forward thing is to be individualistic, battle of the fists. You're going to go and you're going to strive and you're going to do better than everyone else and you're going to build and you're going to do all these things. So we're taught that the people who had a society that was not like that, not battle of the fittest, but instead communal, that those people were inferior. And this is something that we're still dealing with today. Understand, our ancestors, people like Frederick Douglass, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, they were fed images of Africans being savages. They were fed images of Africans just being cannibals, people with bones inside of their nose. They were fed these pictures of us who didn't wear clothes. We just danced around all day. We didn't have any principles. We didn't know who we were. They were fed these images from a very young age. Now, do you think that those images, even if you didn't see the images that they saw, do you think that it disappeared from the psyche of Africans? Soon as they died? You don't think that they passed those things down or previous generations throughout to their children? You don't think that those still have an effect inside of us today whenever you see someone who was so upset to say, "Hey, you are an African," that they will completely lash you? And I'm saying again, I have got lashed for saying that we are African. You don't think that those things are still in the subconscious of us? They are still in the subconscious. So many of us still think that everything that we see as far as Africa being colonized, we see the civil wars, we see all the horrible things. They think that it's because Africans are intrinsically savage, that Africans are intrinsically not civilized. That's what they think. And these things are only continuing because we have not been ready to challenge the historical narrative, first, of Africa being some backward society. One, because if you think about it, a lot of the talk that happens around Africa and advancing Africa is basically about losing its Africanness. So we want development that looks like Europe. We want development that looks like China. We want development that looks like anything but Africa. So we have to challenge these notions. We have to be very direct in understanding that all because something looks good doesn't mean mean that it's good for us. And we also have to call out these African politicians who are doing things to sabotage the people whenever they want to go back to more African and indigenous ways of doing life. You know, why do we have Western medicine in Africa where indigenous African medicine was doing quite well and didn't have 1,000 side effects that you have with American medication? These are the questions that you should be asking. So I'm going to go ahead and ask if anyone has questions. Let me go back to the screen. All right, so I'm scrolling through. I don't see any questions yet. So maybe everyone were on the same page, which is all good. And I'm going to go ahead. Okay, so I don't see any questions yet. Like I said, if you have any that come out, you know, please just put some question marks so I can see the questions and we'll go through. So let's take this back to child welfare. I said earlier that something that was very different about the assimilationist campaign for African people that was not the same for non-Africans overwhelmingly is the fact that the push for assimilation really was many times driven by the leadership, the bourgeoisie leadership. And I think, again, we're talking about these images, this idea that we're inferior, we have to get away from who we are and become like them. This is what the leadership were fed. So obviously these same people, whenever they go through universities and they're taught that this is what's good and this is what's bad, their mission when they go back to their poor, destitute communities is, hey, y'all, we have to get like them. That's what they were essentially trying to do, many of them. So let's talk about the National Urban League. Probably the most, I actually remember when I found this tidbit of information when I was researching for the book, the most shocking revelation that I had was that the child welfare system, as far as including African children, and we know today, disproportionately African, the reason that we're even in the child welfare system really began whenever organizations like the National Urban League pushed to have African children inside of the child welfare system. I'm going to read from a quote from Billingsley and Giovanni. They have a book called Children of the Storm, a very good, it's an older book actually, but it was very, very good at breaking down the child welfare system. This is a quote. They said, the Urban League's strong insistence that the same system serving white children operating in the same way should serve Black children. And it had the ironic effect of actually strengthening the system and forestalling changes that would have made it more specific to the situation of Black children. So we see something that we see many times today. As hard as it is to believe, as I said before, at one time, African people were not inside of the child welfare system. We basically had our own internal child welfare system. We cared for our own children. You had aunties, uncles, and they didn't have to be blood related. They could just be someone in your community who becomes a part of your family because the community was the family, right? That's what was done whenever children's parents were not able to take care of them or children's parents passed away. Essentially, you had people step in, and because that's who we are, that's what we did. Now, instead of seeing the value and what we had, the value inside of this kinship system, many of the leaders looked over and said, well, we have this kinship system, but white society, they have this foster care system. It's this new thing that's happening, and it's you know, they're taking these children, they're putting them inside of these great homes. Well, instead of seeing the values in the kinship system, they said, no, we want that. We want what they're offering. We want for the states to basically take these children so that they could be done, so that we could be equal, right? Because we don't want anything, we want everything that's available to white kids to be available to our kids as well. That was literally the idea behind it. So yes, you had a push from civil rights organizations to actually have us integrated into the child welfare system. I do not think that they anticipated what happening today, what, you know, as far as the horrible traumatic experiences. I don't think they anticipated that, but unfortunately, when you have assimilationist logic, you believe that what your oppressor has is good for everyone. It's a sad feature of white supremacy. Now, I'm going to talk about go through some back history. So 1953, there was something called the Minority Adoption Project. That was a project that was implemented by the Urban League. Originally, it actually started out, believe it or not, because there was not enough African children to adopt inside of the formal adoption setting. So again, we had the kinship systems that were informal, but as far as the formal adoption settings, there were not enough white or Black parents or foster parents to take these children in. So they identified this as a problem. Now, at the time, the solution was not, well, let's put the Black kids with white parents, because again, at the time, it was basically separate but equal. So it was really on the community to find more African parents who were going to be able to, foster parents who were going to be able to take children. And so that's what the Minority Adoption Project was about. That's how it started, but that's not how it ended. Now, one reason that the Minority Adoption Project basically became co-opted was because of a program called Adopt a Child. Originally, it was used, again, to get African children to basically go with African families, because that was the only thing that was available at the time. But what it morphed into was an assimilationist project. Now, I'm going to tell you about a woman named Julian Jones. She was the coordinator, she became the new coordinator of the adoption project, following the succession of the original coordinator. She was a Jewish white woman, and she basically was in the NUL. In her mind, this was a great opportunity, adoption and sending children away, to actually enforce integration, because we should understand that particularly the older civil rights organizations, be it the NAACP or the National Urban League, their idea of saving the Black race was integrating them into white society. So Julian Jones says, putting these Black children with white parents, this is a great way to enforce integration. And she became a voracious fighter for these programs, okay? So this is in the 1950s. In her mind, essentially, transracial adoption was going to lead to integration, because you'll take the child away from their surroundings, and they'll be in white surroundings, and they'll adopt white customs, and they'll have white friends, and they might have a white spouse, and they might just become like white. That was the rationale behind it, okay? I want to read from a confidential report that was published in 1955, and then I'm going to go back and see if there's any questions. So the report says, it's a little long, I'm just going to read through it though. There is a sharp dichotomy between what a Negro considers to be a Negro and what a white person considers to be a Negro, okay? It's published by the Urban League, right? In general, the former defines the Negro in broad terms, not so much on physical likeness, but what the individual and his family and the general community conceives him to be. Thus, an individual may be a biological, sociological Negro. The biological Negro possesses the general physical characteristics which are considered to be Negroid, while the sociological Negro may have the physical characteristics of a Caucasian. But because of a Negro foreparent, he or the community identify him with the Negro race. On the other hand, the white community initially identifies a Negro by the generally accepted physical characteristics of high color visibility, texture of hair, and features. In most cases, when a Negro asks the question, will an adoption agency place a Negro child with a white family? He is really referring to the placement of a child who is a sociological Negro. When the agency is confronted with this question, its mind picture of a Negro child is one who is considered a Negro according to the general interpretation of our society. So you see right here, they're making a distinction. You could be biologically African. You could be, or what they say, a Negro. You could be a biological Negro, they say, but you could also be a social Caucasian. And so it's really the gist of this project. We don't want to see continuance of Negroes who are sociological and physiological Negroes. Let's allow them to be physiological Negroes, but make them sociological Caucasians. That's essentially the assimilationist logic that is being perpetuated. All right, take a break, drink some tea, and we'll see if there's any questions. Okay, so it says, is this assimilationist agenda born out of the belief that the American, i.e., I'm sorry, I just forgot to post on the screen. Is this assimilationist agenda born out of the belief that the American, i.e., white way, being the most optimal way to live? Yes, and it's understandable if you understand that every image that was shown of Africa to these Africans, especially early on before we had power and ability to go into Africa and report and paint a different picture ourselves, it was all negative. You know, you hear it over and over again. It was self-deprecating. Like, why would I want to be someone that is an animal? That's what they wanted us to think Africans were. So absolutely, that's the truth. Okay, let's see. Okay, here's another question. It says, what are some of the factors that created the overrepresentation in the United States? So we're going to go into that next week. This week, we're going to focus on, just the agenda. But next week, you'll hear about step by step, like all the laws that went into the overrepresentation. One thing I'll say now is that you'll find that overrepresentation in foster care system, it might not have been intentional, but this white supremacist system jumped on it whenever it was opportune. So we're going to talk about that next week. Okay, another question. How do we as a community address transracial adoptions? I'm sickened each time I see it, but don't want to know how to address it personally. I think, and I'll talk about this a little later, is that we have to be very loud on this issue. We are loud on other issues, like we're not loud on the foster care system and on the child welfare system. We have to be loud. In the same way that we have so much vigor towards mass incarceration, we have to have similar vigor towards transracial adoptions. Not just that though, but the foster care system in general. When it comes to transracial adoptions, essentially the system has basically made it the case that they don't have to show any racial preference to your children to be placed with other people who are of the same race. Now, if you understand what I talked about before, a couple weeks ago, the Native Americans, they have a law that says you're required by law. If you have a Native American child, you are required to place that child with the Native American family first. And only if you cannot find one, then you have to place that child with a white family. It's called the Indian Child Welfare Act. So these are laws that say that what they can and cannot do. And the only reason the Indian Child Welfare Act came about is because Native Americans, Indigenous Americans were loud and they pushed and they fought and they said, no, you're not going to do this. So the answer is we have to be loud and politically organized. And I feel like we have to really look at the child welfare system the same way that we look at the Jim Crow system and mass incarceration. Because it's going to take that type of political that type of political organization to push for legal changes. That's what we really want. We want changes in the legal sphere. What do you think about multiculturalism? I think it's a theory, honestly, but I haven't. I'll say it's a theory of what society can be, but I haven't seen society be that. So it's hard for me to honestly have a lot of thoughts on it. Obviously, I think all of us, we've had probably good experiences with people of different cultures. I hope you have. I have. But have I had good experiences to the point where it's painted in America to where we're all experiencing things just inside of our different cultural bubbles? No, like that's not what exists. So I think at this point, it's a fantasy. But, I think that if America wants to do what it says that it wants to do, that is actually stop oppressing people of different racial and ethnic minorities, then maybe you'll see a different outcome than what we see today. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next topic. And hopefully we drive this home quickly. Okay, so going back to what happened with the National Urban League. So I already said, obviously, that there was this push that came from a woman named Julian Jones, again, a white woman who was working at the Urban League, right? So in 1957, and this is where you see the standards change as far as the laws, the Child Welfare League of America, that's the organization that essentially sets the protocol for the entire child welfare system. So they basically put out these standards, and the standards overwhelmingly are adhered to across the nation, right? So originally they took a stance when it came to transracial adoption in 1957 that said that basically you should place Black children with no type of reference for whether they're Black, the foster parents are Black, or whether they're white. And this came from a man named David Fanshawe. He was the executive. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This came from Alexander Allen. He was the executive of Pittsburgh's Urban League, and he said that Black people have no distinctive culture and no peculiar social institutions. It only knows the culture of America. Okay, what does this sound like today? Seton Manning, he was the San Francisco Bay Area Urban League executive director. He was actually a Jamaican immigrant. And he was assimilationist, similar to Fanshawe, or Allen, I'm sorry. He said And he goes further, right? At a workshop, he says a non-Anglo whose color happens to be brown, that's what he identifies as. He would say that we have no distinct culture once again. And he taught this inside of a room with 200 social workers, by the way. He said that the Negro group in America has no distinctive culture and no peculiar institutions. The Negro in the United States lives in a society that permanently relegates him to a lower and inferior caste status. He added referencing Garner Myrdal on the issue of caste in America. He went on to describe classic damage theory, quoting that Myrdal's assessment that the Negro was a distorted development or a pathological condition or the general American culture. He went on to say that in some respects, Negroes are not like everyone else. The Negro, in contrast to the white, is more unhappy person. He enjoys less, he suffers more. The final result is a wretched internal life. So you can kind of see that this push, this is from a Jamaican immigrant. We saw the other one from Mr. Alexander Allen, who was an African from the transatlantic slave trade in America, from American chattel slavery. You have similar behaviors, an African from Jamaica and an African from America, right? And they're all subscribing to this idea that Africans in America, we should lose our culture, right? So going on, Julian Jones literally takes these things that are said by these African men, right? And she goes on and basically pushes for this to be the standard policies among all social workers, this idea that Africans do not have a distinctive culture. So I'm going to jump to 1963. The National Urban League, they were given another opportunity to chime in on the issue of transracial adoption. Once again, they failed, saying that basically everything should be colorblind. There should be no distinction as far as whether these African children should be placed in a white home or whether they should be placed in a black home. And these are the standards that were again adopted by the Child Welfare League of America and became the standard for a while. Now, what changed the standard was the Black Power movement. There was a pushback from an organization called the National Association of Black Social Workers. They were a radical, and they still exist today, by the way. And you should look up their position statement that they put out in 1972. But they were a radical Black Power organization of Black social workers. If anyone's a social worker or if anyone's inside of the child welfare system, you should look into joining with other people who share your same outrage of the system to push for things like this. But they put out a position statement and essentially said that transracial adoptions are cultural genocide. And that had such, that allegation specifically at that time had such a huge effect in America that the Child Welfare League actually revised its standards. Now, they didn't say that you have to place African children with African parents, but they kind of made a compromise. And they said that that you should have a preference for placing a Black child with a Black family. But if not, then you place them with a white family. Still better than what we have today. I'll talk about next week the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act of 1994. That was passed under Bill Clinton. That says today you can have no preference. Meaning today, we went back from the Black Power movement, whereas Native Americans have a law that say you must place a Native American child with a Native American family unless you cannot find one. As opposed to that, when it comes to us, there's a law that says, put in place by Bill Clinton, that you can have no preference. If you have a Black child, you cannot even consider their race at all. You place that Black child in the home without any type of reference for where you're placing them culturally. That exists today. So I'm going to take a break before we jump heavily into the transracial adoption debates. Okay, so any questions? Looking for questions. Don't see any, so I think we can keep going. Okay, so the propaganda was just part of the agenda. Absolutely, propaganda is always a part of a political agenda, and it always precedes. We're being conditioned constantly. If you don't know, like, we're constantly being showed images in the media. We're constantly being showed images whenever we go out, because they're trying to condition us to accept their political agendas. And so sometimes it comes before, sometimes it's simultaneous, but you should understand when you're being tricked, because anytime that your oppressor puts a certain image or message out, don't think that it's for your good or for your betterment. It's for their perfection of control over you. Okay, let's see. Another question from the brother says, oh no, I already answered this, sorry. Okay. I think we are good. Okay. Again, any questions? Question marks, please. So let's bring this up to today, okay? The trauma of transracial adoptions. That's what we're going to talk about. Now, whenever you're talking about transracial adoptions versus same race adoptions, there's a big debate that goes on. The argument that the people who are for transracial adoptions make, there's a lot of people who are well known for this. A woman by the name of Elizabeth, I believe, Bartholet. She's a white woman who pushes that transracial adoptions are good because she has children who she adopted who were not of her race. The idea that they try to push is that whenever there are studies that are done, they find no differences as far as how the children are affected and whatnot. So therefore, it must be the case that we just focus on placing children in the best home instead of focusing on placing them with people of their same culture. Now, completely ignoring the studies that were done on indigenous Americans who were placed inside of white homes, they make these types of statements, right? That's actually not true, though, and I'm going to go through some studies just to explain to you, the fact that transracial adoption is a traumatic thing that happens to children, and it's not spoken about often. The reason it's not spoken about is because the people who you mostly hear talking about transracial adoptions are the people who are white, and those are the parents, the people who adopt the children. They basically have a monopoly on the conversation, and it's really the issue is that obviously young children are not in a position to talk about, what effects they've had from being adopted by a white parent. It's often not until the children ages and is older that you can have a real discussion. And I cited, in the book, a couple of examples of people who were adopted by white families who were loving and kind, but they also speak of having trauma that having happened to them. And there are many examples. You could just go out there. There's now like a whole transracial adoptee community, and they literally come together and talk about the fact that they feel lost. So this is a real effect. It's a real damage, and we're just going to talk about some issues that happen with it. So one, there are long-term studies versus short-term studies. Short-term studies, they look at the children with the white parents, the children with their black parents. They don't see a difference, right? The long-term studies, however, you will find a more significant emotional and behavioral issues coming from transracial adoptees. One that I felt like was very compelling actually found, number one, that whenever children are adopted into white families, and of course, oftentimes, if not always, or almost always, those white families are taking those children into white communities, right? That they gain this trust of white people. So whenever they go out into the world from having been adopted by from a white family, they go out into the world and they have a natural trust whenever they experience white adults as opposed to black adults, okay? You see how this is playing out. In addition, they even had a study that said that children who were adopted by white parents, their parents had reported that when those children are around people who are black children, right, around black people, that they experience anxiety. This is what's happening. You experience anxiety when you're around your own people. I'm sure you can see, again, the political advantage that the system has for pushing these things. You don't belong to the African community anymore. You're now a part of the dominant society. You now adopt the customs and you have the same goals and objectives as the dominant society. This is a great advantage to white supremacy because white supremacy does not want anyone to identify as being African. I'm sure you don't know this if you are someone who thinks that being African is backwards, but they are happy when you say these things. They don't want you to identify yourselves as being black even. That's even better for them. Don't identify yourself as being black and don't identify yourselves as being African. They love it. And this is how the white society gets what they want out of us because unfortunately, the self-hatred mechanisms inside of us feed directly into the system and achieve its goals for them, okay? So I just want to read from some testimonials from children who were transracially adopted. This is one, a woman named J.S. Lee. She's a Korean woman, okay? I cite this, and it's so detailed how she discusses having been adopted by a white family and how lost she was culturally. So I'm going to read. She says, like many transracial adoptees with white parents, I was raised in racial isolation, which caused me to have a fractured identity, experiencing racial confusion and internal bias. When I looked in the mirror, the face I saw was not that what I expected or wanted to see. I didn't look like my parents, my siblings, or my friends, or the people who I read about in books and saw in magazines and on television. I was often told race didn't matter, despite the many racist jokes and slurs carelessly flung my way by family, schoolmates, and strangers. When I visited my homeland, she goes back to Korea, it was a complicated mix of reconnection and rejection, pride and pain. I caught a glimpse of the life I may have had and witnessed those thriving from my displacement. Rather than helping to keep struggling families together through social services, Korea had exported more than 200,000 of us. Many call on adoptees for reassurance that most of us are happy, well-adjusted, and grateful. They don't understand that it's possible to love our adoptive families while simultaneously living with trauma and a sense of displacement. Disconnecting from our adoptive family's identity risks losing everything again. Fear and conditioning can cause us to cling to a cloak of whiteness and comply with the safe narrative. We may stay in white communities, surrounding ourselves with predominantly white friends and partners when it's all we've known. We may even buy into aspects of white supremacy, take on family politics that work against us as a racialized group. Do you see this? This is crazy. The self-actualization of transracial adoptees exists on a continuum, often evolving only when we feel safe. This explains why many Asian adoptees don't identify as people of color until immersed into an online community. It takes a lot to break through brainwashing and barriers, even for those raised with racial support. Even with those raised with racial support. I'm going to emphasize that because we're told this narrative of it's okay to do transracial adoption. Just make sure you support that child. Tell them that they're Black. Tell them you're a Black man, you're a Black woman, and you're going to be treated with racism, and you're going to experience things and, take them to African celebrations and festivals, and that will basically erase everything. No, it does not. There's a certain nurturance that you get from your people, a certain identity that you get, not even one that's spoken, often the one that's not spoken. Often when you're just around them and just being yourself, when you understand what it means to be who you are, there are things that you cannot train a child to do with your words or your affirmations, as she's saying right here. But to live authentically, we must consciously connect to our people, history, and culture. There's power in knowing who we are without feeling shame. I no longer feel the need to perform whiteness or for white people. Powerful words, very direct. She goes right in, and you can see the problems that many are facing. Here's one from a Black woman. She was actually interviewed by Jada Pinkett Smith, Red Table Talks, some of your favorite show. And this woman's named Angela Tucker. You can look this up. It's on Facebook, of course. So Miss Tucker, who was she was adopted by a white family. Her mother was homeless at the time, and she had cerebral palsy. I hope I said cerebral palsy, and because of that condition, essentially, her mother was not able to take care of her. She's homeless, so she had to give her up for adoption. She met her mother later on in life, and came back and told us essentially what she feels having been a transracial adoptee. She says, popular culture likes to believe that adopting kids at a young enough age will guarantee a blank slate, and that adoption is only traumatic for those who have experienced neglect and or abuse in their early childhood. However, psychologists know that this is not true. I felt that my parents intuitively understood this, though much of this research wasn't widely known during my childhood. I did not experience any abuse while in foster care. However, I I still have encountered a deep well of longing to know my roots. This can only be explained through the lens of the trauma of being removed from my birth mom at birth. I'm alive, she says, but I'm dead inside in some ways without knowing my culture and not being connected. So for me, I don't feel that transracial adoption is the right solution because essentially we're asking me as a Black woman to assimilate into white culture, but to also keep my Blackness somehow, even though I wasn't raised with it. Looking at my birth mother, and she doesn't have a lot of materialistic stuff, but I still long to be close to her and with her. And that's one thing that adoptees don't feel safe to say. She says adoptive parents have commanded the whole conversation. Unfortunately, we rarely hear from adopted people themselves. So these are some very straight to the point issues that we're identifying. And I also hope you see the trend as far as, again, when we talked previously about the transracial adoptees who are Native American. There was reports that whenever these children were adopted, or rather the people who went through these Indian boarding schools where they were completely wiped from their culture as children, they would try to go back to their communities, but different things would happen. You would have instances where they felt like they were better than those people who were their family, who were their community, because they've been raised into whiteness to think that whiteness is better than whoever, anything else, right? Then a lot of times the community no longer felt connected to them. And let's be real, I think many of us have experienced this, maybe on one side or the other. Maybe your friend or your relative goes to some nice, great college and comes back talking different and walking different, and they don't seem the same. Or maybe that you have a cousin that grew up on a different side of town and they come to the family functions and you just don't relate the same. So we felt this, I think in different types of degrees, probably universally, that whenever people identify and adopt these white customs, it really does cause a disconnect to the communities. And so the question again, as someone pointed out earlier, the question is, if the system knows this, if the United States government knows this, why are they not changing these laws? There is a trauma that comes whenever you place Black children with white families, the same as there were whenever we placed Native American families with white families, children with white families. Are you saying that our culture is not as important as Indigenous American culture? Are you saying that African children don't need us the same way that Indigenous American children need their community? What exactly are you saying? I think that's what we should be asking the politicians. Like, what are you saying when you say that there should be no racial preference whenever it comes to African children, but there should be racial preference when it comes to Indigenous American children? And until we are the ones to push this issue again, this is not going to change. So I'm going to close this off with actually, I'm going to look for questions. I'm going to close this off with a tragic story I'm sure many of you have heard and I've talked about on this channel. But the story, when I did more research into it, I think it gave the Asian woman's name, it gave more insight into what happened to this child. So her name is J.S. Lee. She's a Korean woman. And I cite it in the book, but you can also look her up, I'm sure. And let's see, I'm looking for any other questions before we get to the tragic story of, I'm sure many of you remember, Devonte Hart. In case you don't remember Devonte Hart, let me show you who he was. I'm sure many of you might remember because it was all over the news whenever this happened. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I hope everyone can see this. Devonte Hart, this is who he was. And I say was because unfortunately he passed away. This image, and let me make sure, by the way, that everyone can see it. Okay, yes, we can see it. This image that was shared on mainstream media was supposed to be racial reconciliation. This is in the aftermath of the Ferguson uprising, and the media was looking for a way to calm down the Negroes like they always try to do. They seen this child. He's a young child who was hugging this white officer, and as a teenager, and they took this picture. Some white reporter took this picture, took it to the news, and they're like, "Aha! This is what we're going to use for the Ferguson protest, right?" And it was all over the news. I remember seeing it. Like, really, are we really doing this right now? Unfortunately, Devonte Hart has passed away, as well as with his siblings. These are his siblings who were adopted by a white couple. Very sad story. Essentially, what happened is that this white couple took these children and drove off a cliff, killing the entire family. They did this because they were being investigated by child services. The thing that was not emphasized, I think, enough was that prior to doing this, they had a long history of abusing their children. They had a long history of child maltreatment. They had a long history of their children basically not even being fed. Like, there's stories of the children, their adopted children. I'm sorry. There's the stories of their adopted children going to neighbors' houses, knocking on the door, saying, "Please, can I have some food? These ladies aren't feeding us." This has really happened, everyone. And these people drove these children off of a cliff. So I want to go into more details about this story that I did not know until I did some more research. So what I did not realize is that after the picture came out following Ferguson, you see this Black child holding this white couple, or holding this white officer. It got out to the news that, oh, it's not just the Black child. There's also this issue of them having white parents. And this was going to be a great story because to everyone's friends, the Hart family, to their friends, they were just a beautiful family. And they were an example of what America should be. And this is what America should become. So that's what, was fed in the media. And whenever the mainstream media got whiff of this fact that they adopted all of these Black children, they jumped on it and really focused on this story as a way to show what racial reconciliation looks like, right? So I'm going to read from one of these stories. This is an interview that was done. Just the woman's name were Jennifer and Sarah Hart, who killed their adoptive children. The title of the story: Meet Devonte, the little boy with a big heart. The article describes Devonte as a young boy who was born into a life of drugs, extreme poverty, danger, and destined for a bleak future, who is defying the stereotypes in a remarkable way. Devonte, this is what this is what I believe this is what the article says. It says Devonte entered the world at 12 years old. Okay. Don't get mad, y'all. This is me literally reading what the article says, okay? He entered into the world at 12 years old with drugs pumping through his tiny newborn body. By the time he was 4 years old, he had smoked, consumed alcohol, handled guns, been shot at, and suffered severe abuse and neglect. He knew only a handful of words. These are things that the adoptive parents were telling the media. He only knew a handful of words, including fuck and shit, and he was struggled to identify with the names of foods, body parts, and everyday objects. Devonte was a violent toddler. They really put this out there. He was a violent toddler, and his health was weighed down by a heavy list of disabilities. It was a life with little hope and a future that seemed over before it began. That is until Jen Hart and Sarah entered Devonte's life and adopted him and his his two siblings 7 years ago, because it wasn't just him. He had two siblings that also went into foster care with him. Now, there's also a Facebook post where Jennifer Hart went into details about what she says issues that she had with Abigail, Hannah, and Marcus. These were another group of biological siblings. She said Abigail urinated everywhere and gnashed her chin falling down the stairs. Hannah smeared feces on the walls and gorged herself with food until she needed the Heimlich, resulting in several episodes of projectile vomiting. Marcus, she said, hit his head on a closet wall and in multiple voices claimed to be possessed by demons. Yet she and Sarah were committed to healing the children over time. She wrote on her Facebook, "If not us, then who?" These are the people who were praised by the media. And the same media, of course, disappeared whenever these same people drove these children off of a cliff. Now, I want to emphasize, I am not saying at all that this is the case for the vast majority of transracial adoptions, although I will say that abuse is very common whenever you're having children being placed inside of these homes, whether it's a foster home or adoptive home. Do not think that that child is going to a better circumstance. This level of killing a child. No, that's not something that's common, but it does happen, and that's important to know. But if there's anything that you don't take away, look at how these white women frame themselves as far as taking care of these children. We know obviously these are lies. Like, there's no way that all of these children came inside of their home just like vomiting everywhere, cussing, didn't know anything, didn't know their words and all these things. These women bred into their psyche that these children were so inferior and we're going to save you. And they went out and told the world this story, and the world ate it up. We should be calling to task every single person who reposted these stories or who praised these women, and asking them to look back at what happened and do a thorough investigation of this issue of transracial adoption. Because what you spewed out was not just, it had effects. When you're looking at painting something that is not good for us, is painting it good. The other thing that I researched about this family that I really was not aware of, and I think it's important that we all know, is that Devonte and his two siblings, they had parents. Obviously, they had parents, but their parents were a couple named Davis and Celine. And they, Sherry Davis and Clarence Celine. I'm jumping through my notes, everyone. Sorry. They were the parents of Devonte, Sierra, and Jeremiah, 3 of the children who were killed by their adoptive parents. They originally lived in Texas with their parents, and essentially the children went into foster care because Miss Davis had struggled with cocaine, and then Mr. Celine was incarcerated. I said earlier, a lot of times whenever it comes to parent incarceration, it will be one parent who is incarcerated, and because they're incarcerated, they say you're not available for your child, so therefore we'll just terminate your parental rights. So the father was incarcerated and the mother was struggling with drugs. It's important to emphasize, despite the fact this woman was struggling with drugs, she was maintaining a job and taking care of her children. There's many stories, and just talk to the community. There's many people who were dealing with drug abuse and still functional. It's not good to take drugs. We're not justifying taking drugs. Obviously, we don't want this poison inside of our communities. But the idea that automatically makes you an unsafe parent, that's just not true. Now, she had worked 2 jobs, by the way, when she was still using. She was a live-in care and a housekeeper while she was dealing with her cocaine addiction. So essentially what happened is that the state came in, they took these 3 children from her, right? She actually gets into treatment, is starting to get help, right? She's in drug treatment. But something happens. One day, her sister who was taking care of her children, that was the placement for the children. Her sister has her sister over, but she's not supposed to be with the children. She's not supposed to be unsupervised with the children. So she left her with her own children. And because of that, the state said, we're going to take those children from their aunt and we're going to put them into another home. And from there, they terminated her parental rights. This actually drove her back into substance use. So the horrible, horrible thing, number one, after the children were murdered by their adopted parents, after they were driven off of a cliff, the state didn't have the decency to tell their parents. They did not tell Miss Shelley Davis and Mr. Clarence Celestine that their children had been murdered by their adopted parents. The only reason that the parents even found out that their children were murdered was because the state or because the news had covered the story, and the aunt of the children, the one who was the foster care placement, recognized those children as being the children, her nieces and nephews. So they didn't have the decency to tell the people who they stole their children and terminated their parental rights that their children have been killed, right? Even more tragic, and this is the case a lot of times, whenever your child is in foster care, the state essentially gives you 1 year to get your act together before they basically terminate your parental rights. And by the time that the children had been killed, Mr. Clarence Celestine, he had been out of prison. He had a job, landscaping job, has a successful business. Miss Shelley Davis, she is out of drug addiction. She is successfully clean. Their parents were ready for them when they were killed by their adopted parents. This happens a lot because if you don't know, people who are dealing with societal trauma don't necessarily heal in 1 year. A lot of times they need services. A lot of times they need time. They need healing, personal healing. This idea that we're just going to end your parental rights and adopt your children off because you were not ready when we told you by the law you had to be ready is horrible. So I hope that I painted for you all a very bleak picture of what we're dealing with as a people. We're dealing with cultural genocide, and we're dealing with a state that is very violently going at our children, trying to tear them away from us, and even indifferent whenever they're being abused by their adoptive families. Because to emphasize again, the Harts, Sarah and Jennifer Hart, I think was their name, they had abused the children and been reported numerous times, and the children were not removed. Because of course, whenever you see these white people taking care of these black people, black children, oh, it's such a wonderful thing, so we're just going to give you the benefit of the doubt. But that benefit of the doubt literally led to these children's deaths. So I'm sure many of you are asking the question, well, if that's the case, the big question, right? Well, if that's the case, and we don't want black children to be adopted outside of their communities, right? Then what are we going to do as far as if there's not enough black adoptive parents? Well, you shouldn't be asking the question at this stage. You shouldn't be asking, why aren't there enough black adoptive parents? And I believe that there are things you can do, by the way, to recruit more. There's some things that have been proven, intentional efforts to let African people know, hey, we need more adoptive parents. So there's things that have been proven. But even if there was a gap and there were still more black kids who were not able to be placed inside of homes with black people, what do you do inside of that situation? They have to be placed somewhere. Absolutely. But that's not where the problem begins. The problem begins when you remove the child from their family, when you put that child into foster care, when you put that child at the mercy of the state. Many times they did not have to be removed. Many times they could have stayed with their families and been given proper services. Many times there are children who are literally in foster care for no other reason than their parents didn't have enough money to be able to afford childcare or be able to afford food. These are the things that happen so often. So if you're wondering, well, what are you going to do for all the children who are in foster care that don't have white adoptive or who don't have black parents who could take them? Just stop taking them from their parents, but they don't need to be taken from their parents. It's very simple. So that's what I'm going to end it. I'm going to look for some questions again, see if anyone has any questions. Looking for question marks. Let's see. But I hope you all learned something. This is like something that's very bothersome to me, and I'm sure it's bothersome to you all. What's the counter solution for transracial adoption? I kind of covered that just now. Obviously, there's ways that you can recruit more black parents, but just stop removing children from parents when they don't need to be removed. That will solve so many problems. Trust me. Again, as if you don't remember, I reported weeks ago, the number one reason children are removed from their parents is neglect. Over 60% of children in foster care is for neglect. Neglect is not abuse. Neglect is literally, you don't have enough to take care of your children. That's what neglect is. So rather than removing the child, why don't you take those same resources and those same services that you were going to give, or the same resources you're going to use to pay that foster parent, and use that to actually service the families. But they won't do that because they have a direct agenda to see you taken from your children. So that's what the state is doing. That's why they're doing it. And so it's important for us to be the voice to out these people whenever they're doing things like this. Okay, so I don't see any final questions. Who raised? I don't know. Who raised Congressman Tim Scott? I do not know. Who raised the Kentucky Attorney General? I don't know. These are good questions. I don't know who raised these people. But you know what? Sometimes you can be raised in a black family and easily be a chameleon. You just go into one setting and you can become like them. So who knows? So I'm going to wrap this up. Next week, we're going to be talking about the big issue. African children, whenever the foster care system, basically, if you look from the 50s and before, we were basically not in the foster care system, almost not completely in the foster care system. Then you have the 60s and the 70s, and we're not only in the foster care system, we're drastically overrepresented inside of the foster care system. What happened between point A and point B? That's going to be the big thing that we're going to have to cover. So we're going to cover that next week. We're going to go through all the laws that led to essentially the foster care system that we see today. And we're going to go into a lot of things that happened in the 90s with everyone's favorite president, Bill Clinton. I'm kidding, obviously. But obviously, we all know about, many of us know about the prison industrial complex. We know about the crime bills that were passed in the 90s. Many of us even know about the welfare reform bills that were passed in the 90s to cut Africans off of the welfare system at a pivotal time. But many of us don't know about the child welfare acts that were passed by the same administration. Not one, not too many that were passed that, to me, took direct aim at the African community. So we're going to talk about that next week's very important discussion. So I hope that you enjoy. Let me actually post the link to the book one more time for anyone who did not see it. And I do see a question. Are we doing the book reading tomorrow? Yes. Actually, let me schedule that right after I log off of here. Yes, 10 a.m. tomorrow. I hope to see you all, WCC Podcast and Book Club. We're going to be covering a number of topics happening throughout the African diaspora, and we're going to be reading Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So I hope to see everyone there, and thank you everyone for tuning in.